The ESG Decoded podcast celebrates Women's History Month and recognizes the contributions and achievements made by women. ClimeCo, which powers this podcast, believes that supporting Women's History Month and International Women's Day aligns with its core values, particularly that of stewardship. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, is integral to our culture, encouraging all employees to use their unique perspectives, experiences, and ideas to help advance business outcomes and foster a culture where everyone feels their viewpoint is valued. We embrace equity for women and endeavor to provide a platform to share best practices on how we can all contribute to gender equity. Enjoy this episode.
Hi everyone, welcome back to ESG Decoded. I'm your host, Caitlin Allen, and today I'm very excited to be in studio in Frederick, Maryland with Kaidi Johnson. Kaidi, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited about this. Kaidi is the Vice President of Legal and ESG at Motorola Solutions. She is a strategist, solutions architect, and business-minded attorney with more than 20 years of experience. She is a trusted advisor to executive leadership and the board of directors. She's also a founding member of Chief and spent 11 years serving as an adjunct faculty member at the University of Maryland, in addition to numerous other corporate roles. Kaidi, you just have a wealth of experience, both as an attorney, but also as an attorney in the ESG space. So excited to hear your perspective today.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. Well, I love to start with career journeys for folks that have had really interesting paths, which I think you're one of them. Let's start a little bit with that. You began as a corporate attorney. How did you come to be an expert in the ESG space?
Sure. Much like most of my journey, things just sort of came my way, so to speak. I started out in law school in advocacy and litigation. Upon graduating law school and starting into the career profession, I ended up in the federal space and doing a lot of government contracting. And so I joined Motorola Solutions in 2011 in their federal division, supporting their sales contracting in that space, and then eventually sort of worked all different parts of the business, all in the legal context. An opportunity was presented based on sort of my experience sort of operationalizing departments and sort of helping to bring governance and structure into spaces that were, new and emerging, so to speak. So I was asked to lead our ESG program office back in 2020, right in the middle of pandemic. A lot of things were happening socially and culturally. So it was a really interesting time to kind of dig into all things environmental, social, and corporate governance, and having a full appreciation and understanding in terms of what that means for our stakeholders and then what that means for our shareholders.
I'm picking up on something you said, which is one of the reasons that you were selected to lead this is because of your experience at operationalizing in emerging areas. I think that is such a theme that I've heard, particularly our attorney friends that are now doing ESG or overseeing. I always used to joke that I think it's because they know lawyers read. They're like, what is this big confusing thing? Attorney, we know you'll spend the time to read it. So I think that's an interesting common thread that I've heard. But tell us a little bit about that operationalizing. What has that meant for you at Motorola Solutions?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of it has been educating employees and our corporate leaders about the difference between social responsibility and ESG, because a lot of times people sort of approach it or think about it in the context of being one and the same. And so the first thing was just to kind of really understand the difference. And corporate responsibility are all the different programs that you have in place. By contrast, ESG is sort of the reporting framework that you implement in order to sort of bring about awareness and the narrative in terms of the programs that you have and sort of what you stand for and the impact that you have and the footprint that you have, either in the smaller communities that you're in or globally. And of course, for us, we have an impact globally with employees in many countries around the world. So from an operational standpoint, I think with ESG and the overlay with SEC, the overlay with the investor community, it's really important to kind of understand the different frameworks. It's important to understand the different stakeholders and sort of what their agenda is, for lack of a better word, so that you can kind of take what we're doing and sort of pulling the data out, and so that you can then turn and report that in a way that is compelling, but certainly truthful. We don't want to have any greenwashing.
Absolutely.
And really is responsive to the stakeholder community as well as the shareholder community. What that translates into is having an appreciation for the reporting frameworks and the information that they're looking for, implementing programming to say, hey, this is what folks are looking for. This is what we do. We don't talk about it very well. Let's do better about talking about it very well. Or these are the things that people are interested in. This is what's material. And we are a little weak in the programming. Let's look at different programs and different initiatives that we can incorporate so that over time the data is there and we can report out on that and just show that incremental improvement year over year or time after time.
Interesting, the emphasis on the reporting frameworks. I think that's certainly something that I think a lot of clients, we get in the door and they think they're like starting from scratch. But when we start really asking questions and doing an assessment of what's material, as you said, you realize it's often a lot of things that are already being done and actually may have a very mature program, but people aren't thinking of them as, oh, this belongs in an E, S, or G category. And there's a standard way to communicate about that. How do we translate what we're already doing into that standardized framework for reporting? So I think that that's an important point, especially for I know a lot of our listeners are people like you, they're sitting in a corporate role and then someone says, okay,
you go.
You got to figure out ESG.
Yes.
So I think that's an important positive thing. You're probably not starting from scratch.
Certainly not starting from scratch, but it's been interesting because we incorporate ESG in our proxy. And it's been great to see over the course of the last 3 years, just the evolution in terms of what we've been able to report, the data that we're collecting, because the awareness in terms of, what I'm doing does actually tie into this, and I think for the longest time people took for granted in terms of how their day-to-day or how specific goals that they might have departmentally sort of really does influence how we actually give back to the communities or how we support the communities or how we might have deleterious effect on our communities. And so it's been great to say, oh, wow, if I had my way, the proxy section, the ESG section of the proxy could be 20 pages long because we've just been able to collect more data, have more programming that allows for more data, but then just the expanded awareness where people are like, oh, when I design product with this in mind, this fits into ESG. Or, the time that I spent last weekend at my son's high school doing debate, right, for STEM or whatever. Those are the types of things that they appreciate, that the volunteerism was always important, but how that sort of feeds into the social component has really sort of helped in terms of our ability to encourage more engagement, encourage more ownership at the employee level, at leader level, at executive level, but then certainly, to reflect that in the reporting.
So you bring up something that I know is difficult for a lot of attorneys, which is disclosing more. I know some certain legal departments are like, one end of the spectrum, let's not say anything. And then others are much more forward about putting things in regulated filings. So how do you think about that as an attorney?
We do a lot of benchmarking just to kind of understand what others are doing, sort of what the standards are, what looks well, what's working well in the industry, and trying not to overshoot, err too far on the side of conservative in that vein. I think that there are some years where you have a tremendous amount of things to talk about because you've made the commitment to net zero, or you've done your TCFD report, or you hired a CDO, all the different things. And so I think it ebbs and flows in terms of the disclosures, but it definitely starts with benchmarking to kind of look at what your peers are doing. Those that are best in class, just regardless of the industry, just to kind of get a sense as to what they're doing and how they're reporting and the level of disclosures. We definitely yield more into disclosing through our corporate responsibility report, just because that allows us to have more narrative and be a lot more descriptive, rather that than to have a proxy statement that's 400 pages long.
Right.
No, but because you want people to read it, So, and you want people to find the ESG section in your proxy. Not everyone is doing an ESG section of the proxy. Some people just hit the highlights with half a page or a page. Some people tend to be more closer to 10 pages, and we kind of sit right around 6 or 7 pages just based on benchmarking, based on the programs and activities and what we have to report, and then trying to be careful not to be overly repetitive with what we know is going to be reflected in the corporate responsibility report some weeks later. Oftentimes, the proxy is sort of a preview of what you might see in the corporate responsibility report, with the expectation that you'll see a lot more detail, a lot more granularity in the corporate responsibility report.
That is so helpful. I know that, a lot of people come to this podcast because they really want that actionable, what is this concrete thing that I can do? What's a step that I can take? So thank you for sharing that, because I think it's very concrete and helpful for folks that are listening. One of the other things that you and I have spoken about, and I think is really important, switching gears slightly, going to the diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI conversation, which I know was part of your remit, isn't currently, but has been.
Yeah.
We very much recognize that the ESG space is not very diverse, right? And you can just look at our guests, on ESG Decoded, right? Who is actually running most of these funds, et cetera, et cetera. I want to highlight you as a Black female leader in this space and hear your perspective on how we make this space reflect the world.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, it's certainly no different than many other departments or business purposes, within any corporation. When we talk about lack of diversity, if you will, in the ESG space, the ecosystem is quite large, because in the ESG space, we're talking about board members, we're talking about executive leaders, we're talking about the investor community, we're talking about peer practitioners that are in the space of environmental or sustainability. We talk about inclusion in this space. There's so much to it, just in regards to ESG. I'm always looking for folks that look a little more like me, and don't always find that. I think that's one of the things that has sort of energized me in terms of taking a full interest in ESG and not necessarily just tucking it in as part of my regular day job. When I'm not doing ESG, I handle other things within the corporation from a legal perspective and leading teams. One thing that I really personally take pride in is sort of being a leader in this space, and quite frankly, in a lot of spaces, it's not just ESG.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
But even more so in this space, because the investment community, environmental sustainability, that's just not where there's a lot of people of color. I think that there's certainly movement towards more diversity in terms of gender, which is never a bad thing. But, certainly a person with intersectionality, it would be good to see a little bit more going forward. But I think that, not to belittle the other roles that I currently have or have had, whether it's teaching at the university level, whether it's leading legal teams for a large corporation, whether it's leading DEI for a large corporation, there are people of color in those spaces. And so I saw ESG and more specifically sustainability, environmental, as a way to sort of stand out even more, as if being a Black woman wasn't enough. But just to kind of draw more attention to this as a profession, either for lawyers, either for those that are thinking about going into sustainability. I think that historically it's been hard to sort of think of, hey, we probably shouldn't use water bottles. And by contrast, if you're in Flint, Michigan, you're lucky to have good water at all, right? Much less give a lot of thought in terms of whether or not this bottle of water is good for the environment. And so I think that in some communities, and certainly underrepresented or underprivileged communities, just the thinking in terms of climate and protecting the environment, you just don't always have that luxury, so to speak. And so I certainly find passion in having an opportunity to bring about awareness. I'm doing work with the Chicago Academy of Sciences to help bring about more awareness, because whenever we talk about people of color as it relates to STEM, it's always engineering, it's always math, sometimes science, but it's almost always in the medical profession and not necessarily in natural sciences. And so I see this as an opportunity to be a model of some sort, to just bring about more awareness and visibility and representation in this particular space.
Thank you so much for that, Kaidi.
Sure.
Kind of makes me think I'm aware of some of the Motorola Solutions outreach programs for recruiting, and maybe if you wanted to touch on that as briefly, I think other listeners will appreciate kind of more concrete examples of how you're doing that.
Sure. I know that outreach for us is more than just going to colleges and universities or HBCUs or, Hispanic serving institutions. It's about having a presence in the communities, whether it's through volunteerism, whether it's through programming with some of our customers, just so that people have an awareness that our company is not only a great place to work, but a great partner, a really highly contributing part of the community. I think all of that is sort of how we have outreach. Not only to retain the best talent and attract and retain the best talent, but also for folks to have an understanding that we do more than just try to retain the talent. We actually do embed into the community. We do have the partnerships with different entities that allows us to have better perspective in terms of, a footprint or a handprint on the world, and how we can program better to address that. And then certainly that helps to inform how we recruit and retain talent.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for that, Kaidi.
Sure.
I think this has been such a wonderful conversation that our listeners are going to get a lot of practical help out of, but also a really important perspective to share. So Thank you so much for being here. Do you have any other closing thoughts before we wrap up?
Well, I guess I would just encourage the listeners to continue to do the good work.
Yeah.
I know that there's a lot of stuff happening out there, especially here in the United States, where people are challenging the value of ESG subtly as well as very forcefully through court proceedings. With or without ESG, corporate responsibility is always there. And I think that's one of the things that we've been really good about reinforcing. Before ESG, and kind of to your point, the infrastructure was already there. The things were already happening. And so with or without it, it's going to continue.
Yeah.
You can't have ESG without corporate responsibility, but you can certainly have corporate responsibility without ESG. I don't think ESG is going to go away. I've been in a lot of meetings lately with investors and different thought leaders, and ESG is still very much high in conversations. And so I don't anticipate that going away anytime soon, despite what might be happening to suggest otherwise. But by and large, whatever the fate might be, I would just say keep doing the good things, because that's really what's the most important. Corporations being citizens, I think that's still very much important, whether you report out on it or not.
Perfect. I'm not adding a word to that. Just end it right there. So well said. Thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate your time.
This is awesome.
I know how busy you are. And it's proxy season.
It's proxy season.